In the societies built on the foundations of slavery, concepts of honor and shame were instrumental in enforcing racial taboos surrounding interracial relationships. The perception of racial purity was not just a matter of law, but was deeply intertwined with social values that govern behavior, particularly concerning marriage and sexuality. In these contexts, white women were often viewed as the embodiment of racial purity, with their honor seen as directly tied to the societal status of their families and communities. Thus, any deviation from the norm, particularly relationships with black men, was met with intense scrutiny and often violent repercussions. For white families, the sexual purity of women was a sacred duty. It was believed that a white woman's honor could be tarnished by any involvement with a black man, an act perceived as a betrayal not only of family, but of the entire racial group. Consequently, the idea of protecting white women from the perceived predatory nature of black men became a rallying point for enforcing social taboos. These fears were often stoked by sensationalist narratives and political rhetoric that painted interracial relationships as a threat to social order. The use of honor as a social construct served to justify the policing of women's behavior and relationships. For instance, white women who engaged in relationships with black men faced ostracism, public shaming, and even violence from their families and communities. This societal enforcement created a climate of fear, where the repercussions of violating racial boundaries were clear and immediate. Such pressures were not only exerted by men but also by women, who often participated in the surveillance of their peers, reinforcing the prevailing norms regarding race and sexuality. The concept of honor was not solely about protecting white women. It also extended to white men. For many white men, the ability to control their women's sexual choices was tied to their masculinity and social standing. Their perceived ownership over the bodies of white women meant that any threat posed by black men was seen as a challenge to their authority and status. As a result, men often felt justified in resorting to violence to defend their honor, leading to acts of vigilantism against those who engaged in interracial relationships. The intersection of gender and race created a particularly oppressive environment for black women during the era of slavery. Enslaved women were often subjected to the brutal realities of sexual exploitation, forced into relationships with white men by their owners or through societal coercion. The dehumanization of black women was pervasive, as they were often seen as property rather than individuals with autonomy and agency. This perception allowed for rampant abuse and exploitation, further complicating the dynamics of interracial relationships. Black women were frequently portrayed in both literature and societal discourse as hypersexual beings, perpetuating stereotypes that justified their exploitation. These portrayals served to dehumanize them, reducing their identities to mere objects of desire. The societal view that black women were inherently promiscuous reinforced the idea that their bodies were available for exploitation, allowing white men to rationalize their actions without facing the same societal repercussions that white women endured for engaging in interracial relationships. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women had profound effects on the family structures within black communities. Many enslaved women bore children as a result of forced relationships with white men, leading to complex dynamics of parentage and identity. Children born from these unions were often viewed as a liability, caught between the worlds of their enslaved mothers and their white fathers. Their existence highlighted the contradictions within the system of slavery, where racial purity was upheld at the expense of black humanity. Moreover, the experiences of black women were often rendered invisible in historical narratives surrounding slavery and race relations. While white women were afforded the status of moral guardians of racial purity, black women's struggles were largely marginalized. This lack of visibility further reinforced the cultural taboos surrounding interracial relationships, as the narratives that shaped societal views often ignore the realities faced by black women who endured both racism and sexism. The enforcement of racial taboos was heavily gendered, reflecting the dual standards that govern societal behavior. While white men could often transgress racial boundaries with impunity, white women faced severe consequences for similar actions. This double standard was rooted in deeply ingrained patriarchal attitudes that placed women's worth in relation to their purity and familial honor. White men who fathered children with enslaved women frequently faced little to no social or legal consequences. In many cases, these men were able to maintain their status and reputation while simultaneously exerting control over the bodies of black women. This hypocrisy illustrated the power dynamics at play, where white men were often viewed as entitled to their desires, regardless of the racial implications. In contrast, white women who entered into relationships with black men were seen as transgressors of the social order. The societal backlash against these women was swift and brutal, as their actions were perceived as a betrayal of both their race and their families. The shame associated with interracial relationships for white women was compounded by the fear of violence from both their communities and the law, creating a culture of silence and repression. This gendered enforcement of racial taboos extended beyond romantic relationships to encompass all social interactions. White women were often expected to uphold the ideals of racial purity, policing not only their own behavior but also that of others. This expectation created a culture of mutual surveillance, where women were encouraged to report any perceived violations of racial norms. Such practices reinforced the notion that interracial relationships were not only taboo, but also fundamentally threatening to the social order. Cultural representations of race during the era of slavery played a critical role in shaping societal attitudes toward interracial relationships. The depictions of black men and women in literature, art, and popular culture often reinforced negative stereotypes that dehumanized them and framed interracial unions as unnatural or immoral. These portrayals contributed to the stigmatization of interracial relationships, embedding racial taboos into the cultural consciousness. The black beast stereotype emerged during this period, portraying black men as dangerous, hypersexualized figures who posed a threat to white women. This narrative served to justify the violence inflicted upon black men and provided a rationale for the strict enforcement of anti-miscegenation laws. By framing black men as predatory, society could legitimize the violence used to protect white women's honor and uphold the racial order. Conversely, the tragic mulatto stereotype depicted mixed-race individuals as products of forbidden love, often caught in a no-man's land between black and white communities. This representation perpetuated the idea that mixed-race individuals were inherently tragic and further reinforced the taboos surrounding interracial relationships. The tragic fate of the mulatto was used to illustrate the supposed dangers of interracial unions, emphasizing the idea that such relationships were ultimately doomed to fail and brought suffering to all involved. These cultural narratives served to normalize the existing racial hierarchies, embedding them within the fabric of society. The negative portrayals of interracial relationships in literature and art helped solidify the taboo surrounding them, making it socially acceptable to enact and enforce punitive measures against those who violated these boundaries. The cultural and social taboos surrounding interracial relationships during slavery were shaped by a complex interplay of honor, shame, gender dynamics, and dehumanizing representations. These factors combined to create a pervasive atmosphere of fear and repression, where individuals faced significant social and legal repercussions for crossing racial boundaries. The legacy of these cultural norms continues to influence contemporary attitudes toward race and interracial relationships, highlighting the enduring impact of slavery on societal perceptions of race and identity. In the final part, we will explore the resistance and defiance against these racial taboos, examining how individuals and communities navigated the challenges posed by a society steeped in racial hierarchies.